have to say, first of all, I am just thrilled and honored to be here among you all. And I thank you all for coming out on a rainy Saturday morning to hear about my research. Keeping kids active, healthy, and safe. It sounds easy, but I think there's a lot of challenges that we face. So I'm going to talk about some of the success stories and some of the challenges that remain as we try and keep kids walking to school and biking and doing all the things that they're supposed to do. So just to give a brief overview, I'll give you some statistics. I'm an epidemiologist. We love statistics, so you can't ever go to an epidemiology talk without having some. I'm going to talk a little bit about advocacy and policy, some challenges, and 3 stories of advocacy successes and challenges. I'm going to talk about body checking in hockey. And for those of you who don't know what that is, I'll explain it a little bit more. Bicycle helmet legislation and pedestrian safety. Then some conclusions, and I hope we'll have time for some questions, and I really look forward to hearing from you and hear your questions and comments. So why is injury prevention important? When I tell people I study injury prevention, some of them look at me like, why is it important? Well, injury kills more children over 1 year of age than all other causes combined, more than cancer, more than any infectious diseases. Every 30 seconds, someone in Ontario visits an emergency department for injury. And almost half of the emergency department visits for teens are due to injury. And injury, you can think, okay, maybe somebody breaks their arm and it heals and that's okay and that's part of normal childhood. But we know more and more that things like concussion and other brain injuries can have long-term consequences that stay with a child throughout their lifespan. The causes of death, this is some of the statistics. You can see for children 1 to 14 years, unintentional injury is the bar at the top. Oops, wrong one, sorry. And these are all the other things: intentional injury, neoplasms is cancer, congenital malformations, things children are born with. But really what's important for me is that unintentional injury is far and away at the top of that list. So why is this important now? Well, Canada's lagging behind. We live in this country where we have lots of resources, we have generally clean water and all sorts of things available to us. We're considered one of the world's wealthier nations. But if you look here, we rank 22nd of 29 countries in terms of the injury deaths per 100,000 children. And we can see places like Sweden and the United Kingdom, Italy and the Netherlands are doing much better at keeping their kids alive than we are. This chart, why is it important now? This is a chart that shows the rate of injury-related emergency department visits per 100,000 children, because that's how we like to do things in epidemiology. And the bars represent the average family income in the residential census tract. So that, basically what this chart shows is that the poorest kids consistently have a higher rate of emergency department visits for injury than the wealthier kids. And we should really be concerned about this because we strive for equity, we want to keep kids, all children, we value them in our society. But essentially, our poorest children are at really, really high risk of injuries that are generally preventable and predictable. And we can see it's especially pronounced in teenagers, and by the time our older people come along, that income gradient, as we call it, or the difference between the richest and the poorest, disappears a bit. So this is a chart showing emergency department visits for pediatric concussion by selected causes over a 7-year period in Ontario. And I think if you look at hockey skating, concussions from hockey are responsible for almost half of the emergency department visits for concussion in kids. It's a big problem. And we know now even more and more about the long-term consequences of concussion, that there's potential for something called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is lesions in the brain. We hear about it in professional athletes. But we know less about what the impact of getting concussions in hockey, what the impact is that going to be on kids' long-term well-being. The other important thing here is bicyclists. And I don't know about you, but I ride my bike. I love to have my kids ride their bikes. That's how we love to get around. It's a fantastic way. It's better for the environment. It's better for me. It's healthier all around. But there's quite a few concussions related to bicycling. So what are we going to do about that? Well, we know that bicycle helmets work to reduce head injuries, so there's something we can do something about. So injuries are preventable, and this is a slide from the World Health Organization's report, the World Report on Child Injury Prevention. And they said in that report, which was written by a group of authors around the world, that implementing interventions that we know work, not doing anything brand new, but just doing what we know works already, could save more than 1,000 children every single day. And so the report describes 24 proven interventions, of which bicycle helmet legislation is one, and points out that many high-income countries have already been able to reduce their child injury death by up to 50% just over the last 3 decades by implementing multi-sectoral, multi-pronged approaches to child injury prevention. So what do we mean by multi-sectoral? We know that injury isn't a health condition that can be treated by a doctor. Preventing injury requires people like the transportation business to work together to make our roads safer, to make our cars safer. It requires people in sectors like the education sector to make our schools safer, to make our playgrounds safer. So it can't just be one person standing alone saying, I'm going to fix child injury. And as we talk about some of the challenges, you'll see that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. But this chart is Sweden. And in 1969, they had about 25 deaths per 100,000 children. And by 1999, that was down to less than 5. We can do this. You know, Sweden took it seriously, and they have all kinds of laws that make sure kids are safe. They have very, very strict drunk driving laws. They have their blood alcohol level for driving in Sweden. Anybody know what that is? 0, exactly. So that makes a huge difference in keeping everybody on the road safe. They have divided bicycle lanes in Stockholm so that cars can't hit the bicyclists, because the bicyclists have their own lane, the pedestrians have their own lane, and the cars get 1 lane out of the 3. So there's lots of things that we could do, that we could learn from Sweden. So I'm going to talk about advocacy and policy, because I firmly believe that as a researcher, we don't do our research in isolation. I can't just do research, publish a paper, and think, okay, my job's done. I can go on to the next paper. I think I actually have to work as a bit of an advocate as a researcher, because I believe that we should keep children active, healthy, and safe, and I believe that researchers have to play a part in that. So advocacy is the deliberate and strategic use of information to influence decision-making. And a policy is typically described as a principle or rule to guide decisions and achieve rational outcomes. So it's not normally used to denote what is actually done. It's normally referred to as either procedure or protocol. So when I talk about policies, I'm going to talk about policies that our legislators and our city officials and our provincial officials can implement that can make a difference to help keep kids safe. So why do I believe so firmly that policy is the way to go? And it's not just because I have a research chair in policy, although that certainly helps. It gets us to focus beyond the individual. So we can say, okay, if somebody gets hurt, we can either blame the victim and say, you know, to the 6-year-old who gets hit by a car crossing the street, well, you should have looked both ways. I don't think that's very helpful. I think kids have a right to be kids. So if you say, okay, we're going to take a step back and we're not going to focus on the individual, we're going to focus on making our streets safe so that that child can cross the street safely. So it allows work on the engineering and environment aspects of injury prevention rather than focusing on the individual, which we know in so many things hasn't worked that well. I mean, we first heard that cigarettes cause lung cancer over 50 years ago, and people are still smoking. So and it can't be because they're not educated, it's because all sorts of other reasons make them continue to smoke. So we can't focus on just telling people what to do, it just doesn't work. But if we focus on the policy aspect, it can result in social change, changes in public attitudes, and awareness and education programs generally are short-lived. And when designated funds are no longer available, the education program's gone, and then what do? Whereas policies tend to last much longer. Once a law is implemented, it tends to stay for a much longer time. And if you have a policy, say, to change the street design, it's hard to change it back and very expensive. So that's why policies are important. Because they're harder to change, and it takes a lot, they can often withstand changes in politicians, decision makers. It's less at the whim of each individual as they come through. So what are some of the challenges? So injury and violence prevention is, as I mentioned, seen as the responsibility of several fields. There's certainly a role for the healthcare field, but the criminal justice, first responders, transportation, education, etc. So this can lead to fracturing in the search for solutions because not everybody comes at it with the same lens. And there's lack of an understanding of what is injury and the scope of the injury problem. When I tell people that injury kills more kids than cancer, people look at me and say, "Are you sure?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm sure." But people don't really see it that way. And signs like this, play at your own risk. What does that mean, play at your own risk? I mean, shouldn't we make it safe for the kids to play there? There's generally a lack of knowledge that there are things that work and they exist to reduce the impact of injury and violence. There's also a lack of control over the risk environment. And so thinking about homes, workplaces, and schools, this is particularly true for children because they don't have any control over where they live or what happens in their school. And the role, SDOH is what the social determinants of health. So that's things like poverty. And we know, for example, that as we saw, poor kids are more likely to get injured generally. They're more likely to live in substandard housing. Their schools may not have the money to be repaired. So we have to really think about that and think, okay, this is our challenge. We need to protect those most vulnerable children in our society, and we need to make it right for them. The other thing, injury and violence is not broadly accepted as a public health issue. And I think it is. You know, if every 30 seconds in Ontario somebody goes to an emergency department for an injury, that's a public health issue, and we need to treat it as such. So funding for injury is not commensurate with the magnitude of the problem, and that's a huge issue. So this little chart shows this is the funding, and this is the economic burden. So you can see the funding and the economic burden for heart disease is fairly consistent. For cancer, there's way more funding than the economic burden, but injury, it's just a tiny bit down there. The other thing is that the stigma associated with injury can hamper open discussion. And I think sometimes in injury prevention, we've done ourselves a disservice using words like smart. You know, if you're smart, you won't get injured. If you think, you won't get injured. And that's just not true. So I think we blame the victim and say, well, you know, you got hit by a car because you didn't look both ways before you crossed the street. And that doesn't help anybody. We don't need to blame the victims in our society. And the enduring beliefs of unintentional injury as unpredictable and not preventable. And a colleague of mine at the University of British Columbia does a lot of focus groups. And he said that's what people told him all the time. Oh, you know, injuries happen, you wake up, you get hurt, get over it. And that seems to be still an enduring belief. And I'm not sure why, but it seems to be harder to get some traction around that. And this is a cartoon that I put in the adult says, I don't have to wear a helmet, I'm an adult, and crossed out and says idiot. And everybody laughs, but to me, this is a bit disturbing because again, there's that word idiot. So somehow, if he was smarter, he would have a helmet on. So if he gets a head injury, it's going to be his fault. And again, I think that we have to get away from focusing on the individual. There's what I call nanny state opposition to injury prevention policies. I can't tell you how many times I've heard, you know, oh, we want to get away from the nanny state. We don't want people telling us what to do. And this is a kid wrapped up in bubble wrap. And, you know, kids have to have some exposure to risk. And I do firmly believe that. But I think that if we have policies that work and things that we know are evidence-based, then it's not a nanny state thing. Vaccination isn't a nanny state thing, although I'm sure some people would say that. But I think that we can get away from portraying people as bubble wrapping kids, but rather promoting active, healthy, safe lifestyles. And I think the acknowledgement of the need for exposure to risk is part of healthy child development. Kids need to learn how to run and walk and bike and climb and do all that stuff. One of my personal challenges that really annoys me personally is that the media can portray confusion in the name of balance. So when there was discussions recently about removing body checking from hockey at the Pee Wee level based on evidence, some research that my colleague at the University of Calgary did, every media outlet had, the scientist and then the person who was opposed, who thought that body checking should remain in hockey. And they give these two points of view the same amount of airtime. But in fact, there's 19 studies that show, hey, that's okay. There are 19 studies that show that body checking at Pee Wee level is associated with an increase in concussions. And yet they couldn't find a scientist to dispute that, but they always give it equal airtime. Same thing for bicycle helmet laws. And there's long-standing beliefs that the game, whatever it is, it could be hockey, it could be bicycling, it could be the way the streets are made, it could be the way the playgrounds. There's this belief that that can't change, that we're firmly embedded. I was a kid, I played, I rode in the back of a pickup truck driving around town, and I'm still alive, so I don't know what you're talking about. And that's true. I mean, injury's not that common. Most people are alive. But the fact is, a lot of people died, and a lot of children died. And if an infectious disease killed as many kids as injury does, people would be up in arms about wondering when the vaccination was coming and what was going to happen next. So if I'm really interested in policy, and I want policies to help keep kids safe, I think it's important to understand, I'm a researcher, I know I'm a researcher, I come from a very research perspective. I say that unapologetically because that is my job. But I think in order to change policy, you have to understand a little bit more about where researchers come from and where policymakers come from and how those two perspectives can work. So researchers, we think of ourselves as experts. We spend a lot of time and a lot of energy studying stuff. We focus on what is not known. That's what gets us up in the morning. What don't we know about this? We want to do research first, action later. We need evidence, critical analysis, and we work slowly and diligently, from the time we submit our first grant application till we get the grant back not funded and resubmit the grant application and then actually conduct the research and then publish the study, but get the study rejected first, so we have to resubmit it. By the time we do all that, from the first time we ask a question till the time it's published, it's usually around 4 or 5 years. So that's not a quick process. Whereas for policymakers, they're often generalists working many areas. They want to know what's known. What do we know? Action first, research later. Emphasis on success and the acceptability of this policy to the general public. And they work quickly in a high pressure setting. If you tell a policymaker, sure, I'll have an answer for you in 5 years, they look at you like you're crazy, and you can see why. But so we really need to understand those two perspectives, I think. So we approach things differently. First we generate evidence. And I remember I did my PhD thesis on bicycle helmet laws and found amazing results for bicycle helmet laws in terms of reducing head injuries in Canadian children, comparing provinces with and without. And I thought, okay, I'll do this, I'll publish the paper. In a couple of years, every single province will have bicycle helmet laws. Boy, was I naive. So for the policymaker, they look at the policy change, but they say, okay, what's the acceptability? Is there an appetite for this among our constituents? What's the opposition? And what's the evidence? So for them, the evidence is only one little piece of the whole circle, whereas for us, the evidence is everything. So I'm going to talk a little bit more, not surprisingly, about 3 policies: body checking policies in ice hockey, bicycle helmet laws, and pedestrian injuries. So body checking is it's a defensive move for players on the ice, and it's designed to separate the player from the puck. And it usually manifests itself in what we call hitting. So a player actually physically knocks another player down to get the puck and hopefully to try and score. So it's a popular sport for Canadian children. I think there's over 200,000 children in hockey in Ontario alone. It's played on hard ice with fast skates, sticks, pucks, and boards. And it's associated with injury, of course, and particular concern about concussions. And so there's a concern that allowing children to body check may be associated with injury. So what's the evidence? This was a systematic review done by a student who was an undergrad student of mine at the time. There were 20 studies found that looked at body checking and injury in ice hockey. 19 of them found an increased risk of injury where kids were allowed to body check. And the relative risk ranged from 0.363 to 39.8. So a relative risk means what's the risk of having a head injury if you're allowed to body check compared to where you're not allowed to body check. So if the relative risk is less than 1, it means there's a lower risk. And if it's more than 1, it means it's a higher risk. So there was up to almost 40 times higher risk of injury where body checking was allowed. And so the conclusion of this was that body checking policy should change. So what was the variation then? Most provinces at that time allowed the introduction of body checking at the Pee-wee or 11 and 12-year-old level. Quebec was the only province that introduced body checking later at the 13 and 14-year-old and elite levels only. Ontario previously tried and stopped a pilot study introducing body checking at the 9 and 10-year-old level. And the reason for that was they said, well, if we teach them to body check early, before they've hit puberty and before they're so big, then they'll learn how to do it and it'll be protective. But it wasn't. So this is a study that we did just comparing Pee-wee level injuries in Ontario versus Quebec from 1995 to 2002. And remember, in Ontario, they were allowed to body check, and in Quebec, they weren't. And so the pilot study was introduced around here, so they would have been Pee-wee level around here. And you can see there was no protective effect of learning to body check earlier in Ontario. And these are results from a study by Carolyn Emery at the University of Calgary. And she compared hockey players in Alberta, where she lives, to hockey players in Quebec. And in Alberta, they were allowed to body check at the Pee-wee level, and in Quebec, they were not. And so these are the risk factors for concussion. So the biggest risk factor is body checking. So that 3.88 means that kids in Alberta were 3.8 times more likely to have a concussion playing hockey than kids in Quebec. That's pretty frightening. And then the other risk factor, which comes out in every study, is a previous concussion. So once your child has had a concussion, they're 2.1 times more likely to get another one. And this is scary because we know that the impact of concussions increases with every concussion that you get. So I think that this was a really, really important study. And so I'll tell you what happened after, but this quote, somebody actually wrote this in a newspaper. It says, "Too bad hockey has now become the latest victim of the movement to eliminate all risks from children's lives. In 100 years, when North America has become a third world colony, it'll be some wizened old hockey dad who will be nostalgic for the days when we knew how to compete. Risk on the playground, the court, the field, and in the rink leads to innovation and risk-taking in the marketplace. As the pampered prodigy of the politically correct come to age, don't expect any of them to know how to take a risk in business, in the business world, the laboratory, the operating theater. Their minds will be as pudgy as their bellies with no abilities for strategic, decisive, risk-taking thinking." I thought that was pretty powerful. I'm not sure it's true, but you can understand the challenge to policymakers when they read stuff like this and they say, oh, and especially in the hockey world, a lot of the people are somewhat older when they're in hockey administration, and they are nostalgic for the way things used to be. But then there was this groundswell of change. First, the Ontario Hockey Federation removed body checking from select in-house leagues for all ages. That was a really, really big step. Hockey Canada raised the age at which body checking is introduced based on the evidence. And there was an amazing meeting at Whistler that Carolyn Emery organized, and she had Hockey Canada there, and she had a bunch of researchers and a bunch of policymakers, and everybody was talking about it. And then Hockey Canada had its annual general meeting the following week, and that was when they changed the age at which body checking was introduced. And so it was, researchers at the University of Calgary worked in partnership with Hockey Canada, and they got it done. So moving from hockey, we're going to talk about bicycle helmet laws. So bicycling, also a popular form of transportation recreation. Concerns about bicycle-related head injuries led to the enactment of helmet laws, mostly in the 1990s. Ontario has a bicycle helmet law. It was enacted in 1995. And Canada was following other laws. Australia and New Zealand were some of the first places to start them. So this is the variation in bicycle helmet laws across Canada. We can see Newfoundland and Labrador still doesn't have a bicycle helmet law. Quebec still doesn't have a bicycle helmet law. Saskatchewan still doesn't have a bicycle helmet law. The other thing we can see is this target population is quite different. In Nova Scotia, it applies to all ages, and New Brunswick and British Columbia. But in Ontario, Manitoba, and Alberta, it's only applicable to kids under 18. So there was a Cochrane systematic review done of this. There were only 3 studies that examined the effect of bicycle helmet laws on head injuries, and 2 of the 3 studies reported that bicycle helmet laws reduce head injuries. And 2 studies evaluated the effect of helmet legislation on helmet use, and helmet use did increase with bicycle helmet laws. So there's some evidence that they work. This is just a chart showing bicycle-related head injuries in provinces with and without legislation in Canada. We can see that the legislation group it started at the same place in 94 and 95 and had a more significant drop. After this study was published, Prince Edward Island enacted their helmet laws, and then so did Alberta. So first, the good news, most Canadian provinces have helmet laws for children and youth. But some of these laws only apply to kids under 18. And this is a chart of self-reported bicycle helmet use among youth and adults living in 3 Canadian provinces. So Nova Scotia has all ages legislation, so almost 75% of people in Nova Scotia report wearing a helmet, 77.5% of youth. In Ontario, with under 18 legislation, less than half of youth report wearing a bicycle helmet. And in Saskatchewan, with no legislation, about 1/3 of youth report wearing a bicycle helmet. So we've got some work to do here. The experts don't think our helmet laws are adequate. On a scale of 0 to 10, only British Columbia overall had a high rating of their bicycle helmet law. And I think that's because their bicycle helmet law applies to all ages, it's fairly well enforced, and they believe it works. But Ontario, people here only rated our law 7 out of 10, and Nova Scotia, they rated their law 10 out of 10, which it is, I think, one of the most comprehensive bicycle helmet laws. So helmet laws can be considered only partially successful. The opposition to bicycle helmet laws is persistent, organized, and vocal. If you ever publish a paper on bicycle helmet laws, be prepared, because the hate mail starts coming pretty quickly. I think as researchers, we've failed to work collaboratively with cycling groups. I know most cycling groups oppose helmet laws because they think that cycling infrastructure is more important. Why not prevent the injury in the first place? I agree with them that cycling infrastructure is more important, but bicycle helmet laws do have a role to play. And I think the focus on individual behavior change, actually putting on a helmet, in the absence of other changes like infrastructure, safer bike lanes, it's not as successful as integrating all of those approaches together. So the helmet, this is something from the Bicycle Helmet Research Foundation. It says, at first surprising to many people that the wearing of helmets by cyclists is a controversial subject. There's no research on whether it's controversial or not. Cycling safety is a much more complex issue than many people realize, where best evidence and real-world experience sometimes conflict with received opinion. In particular, opinions as to whether cycle helmets are an appropriate, proportionate, or effective intervention are often dominated by emotion and expressed with exaggeration. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think to me, if you have the statistics to back it up and you show that they're effective and they reduce head injuries, I'm not sure that's an emotional argument, but there you go. So this bicycle helmet research and cyclehelmets.org were established to provide a resource of best available factual information. I couldn't find anything true on that website, and challenge evidence and policies that do not stand up to scrutiny. I'm not sure, but they're there, so it's really, really hard for policymakers when you have such active opposition. So the final thing I want to talk about is pedestrian injuries. So a pedestrian injury, as I think you know, is when somebody gets hit by a car. And the good news is, in Canada anyway, pedestrian injuries are going down. Not so much in Toronto, I'm afraid, and not so much recently. We've seen a recent upswing. But why, anybody want to guess why pedestrian injuries might be going down?
Less people walking.
Less people walking, yeah. And if we look, now this is not a causal relationship for sure, but this, if we look at the slope of these two things, this is the pedestrian injuries going down, this is the trends in child and adolescents being overweight or obese, are going up. So I think that's a problem, right? If people aren't walking, kids aren't walking, the poorest kids are at the most increased risk of pedestrian injuries. Probably because if you get up and your parent has to work 2 jobs and has to be in the factory by 7 a.m., they're not going to be able to drive you to work, to school. So you're left on your own. And this is true in Montreal and Calgary, and we're in the process of recreating this study in Ontario. So the collision rate and the proportion of kids walking to school, this is a study by Dr. Linda Rothman, who is recently a postdoctoral fellow with me, and she, for her PhD thesis, looked and found that there's a slightly increased risk of being hit by a car where a lot of kids walk to school. But if you control this for the built environment, that means you design things like traffic calming, like having school crossing guards, like slowing people down in the school zones and having appropriate stop signs and things like that. Then the association between walking to school and pedestrian injury disappears. So I don't think we've done a great job in child pedestrian injury at all. I think there's so much more work to do there, and I'm really pleased to say that both Dr. Rothman and some other researchers, including myself, are really working with the City of Toronto, with Metrolinx, with the Toronto District School Board to make it safer and more appealing for children to walk to school. Because I think that's just, it's a nice way to start the day, and we really need kids on our streets. So just to conclude, advocacy within injury prevention is critical for things to change. There is definitely a role for evidence in injury prevention policies and advocacy. As researchers, we need to generate that evidence, we need to communicate that evidence, and we need to really make sure that it gets out there in a way that people are able to understand. Generating the research is not sufficient to change policies in most cases, though. I mean, I don't know how many of you have read an article in the New England Journal of Medicine recently. Probably not very many. You know, I think that academics publish our papers, which is important, but then if it stops there, it doesn't ever get translated down the line. Researchers really need to understand and address the barriers to change and the potential impact of those changes. And the role of relationships with those who have authority to make decisions is really critical. I think in all the years that I've been doing this, the relationship building is the one thing that I was totally unprepared that I needed to do, and that I've found has been the most important thing that I can do as a researcher to prevent child injuries. So we have to work towards establishing those relationships. So I just wanted to acknowledge York and the Canadian Institute for Health Research, who funds our research, and Parachute, which is Canada's National Injury Prevention Organization, does a lot of wonderful work around knowledge translation, about getting information out there to people to prevent injuries generally. And I love children's books, and I think, you know, unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing is going to get better. It's not. That's Dr. Seuss. Thank you.